Today's reading is from Rays of the One Light, Weekly Commentary on the Bible and Bhagavad Gita by J. Donald Walters. This week's reading is, "In surrender lies victory. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within." The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. A case might be made for surrender as a path to victory in worldly conflicts, the way of passive resistance, for example, in preference to armed resistance. But our point here concerns a higher kind of surrender, the surrender of our deluded, egoic will to the wise and almighty will of God. Human will is, as Paramahansa Yogananda used to say, guided by whims and limited understanding. The divine will is in harmony with every level of reality. Though the divine will sometimes appears to us at first to be wrong, it proves always eventually to be for our highest good. Human will is inconsistent. It leads us one day to success, another to disaster. The divine will, when we surrender to it completely, although it is not always easy to do so, always brings us deep inner peace and joy in the end. Jesus Christ demonstrated this perfect surrender to God's will in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night before he was captured and imprisoned, preparatory to his crucifixion. He went apart from the others to pray and asked them to pray also. But when he returned to them, he found them asleep. Out of his love for them, he excused them, saying, "The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." He then urged them again, saying, "Watch and pray." Their weakness in those circumstances was particularly sad, and the disciples themselves must have regretted it bitterly later on. We all know the symptoms of human weakness, although we may excuse them in ourselves, saying, "Well, after all, I am only human." But what are the signs of true strength? We find in all cases that these are the fruit of a life wholly surrendered to God. The Bhagavad Gita lists these signs in the 13th chapter. Humbleness, truthfulness, and harmlessness. Patience and honor, reverence for the wise. Purity, constancy, control of self. Contempt for sense delights, self-sacrifice. Perception of the certainty of ill in birth, old age, and frail mortality, disease, the ego suffering, and sin. Detachment, lightly holding thoughts of home, children, and wife, those ties which bind most men. An ever tranquil heart, heedless of good or adverse fortune, with the will upraised to worship me alone unceasingly. Loving deep solitude and shunning noise of foolish crowds, calm focus on the self, perceived within and in infinity. These qualities reveal true wisdom, Prince. All that is otherwise is ignorance. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om.
everyone. My microphone on? Okay, must be. What a great topic. And what a great understanding of this topic as well. So the topic today, in surrender lies victory. Wow. I had an interesting day with this topic yesterday. I couldn't quite concentrate on it. I'm going to take my glasses on and off as I look at notes. But I kept coming back to these qualities at the end in the Bhagavad Gita reading, because I've been helping to teach the Raja Yoga class, and I couldn't help but notice that the qualities that are there for us to consider are the ones that have to do with the yamas and the niyamas, the do's and don'ts on the spiritual path. But backing up, I want to make the main point of this, one of the main points of this topic, and that is that, it's easiest for us to think that there's a delusion out there that we all participate in to some degree or another, and that is what I want must be the right thing. And yet what this reading points us to is the understanding that there's this great overarching will of the universe which sees every aspect of reality, is that better? And which is able to, when you think about it, it's thrilling. It's that consciousness that underlies every part of creation, that keeps in motion the planets, that inspires the flowering of plants, that guides, to the extent we're willing to tune into it, each one of our lives and the course of our progress to the extent that we're willing to tune into it. How exalted, how beautiful. And it's something that we can all tune into and live our lives in harmony with. So the surrender that we're talking about here is a surrender. So you can think of it as this great flow of energy, this great flow of water down to the infinite sea of cosmic consciousness. And when we are engaged in, somehow the word celebrating came to my mind, celebrating our own little egoic will, well, that's the part of us that's identified with this one tiny little body, this one little life. And not only that, the little predilections, the little likes and dislikes, the little desires that are attendant upon a faulty understanding, that which sees only a teeny, teeny part of the truth. Kriyananda, the founder of Ananda and direct disciple of Yogananda, whose teachings we follow here, likened it to a little whirlpool or eddy, like when Styx, or have you ever been along the side of a river and you see a little whirlpool that's keeping a bunch of junk floating around, leaves and sticks and things like that, whereas the greater flow goes right on by and is clear. So our little will is like that little eddy. We draw into it all the little likes and dislikes and desires, and we can't then enter into that larger stream of life. So what we're doing when we surrender our little will is that we're actually just giving up a tiny little focus on things that are habitual, on things that come out of our fears, that come out of the subconscious, that come out of perhaps even conditioning from society, that come out of our own karma from past lives and what we've built up in this life, hopefully not too much. But it's a concentration upon that as opposed to opening up to this vast will that's going to carry us through clear streams into that lovely ocean of bliss, ever new joy. So a couple of things that the reading makes the point of is that this joyful surrender, for one thing, it's the reading, the Bhagavad Gita reading, it's so beautiful. It's one of my favorites. And another phrase that keeps coming to my mind is, the will upraised to seek me alone. Gosh, what does that mean? Well, for one thing, it tells us that we have to engage our will in understanding and tuning into the divine will. It's not a passive thing. It's not something like where the divine will is this big thing trying to smack us or smash us or squash our will. It's not that at all. What we're trying to do is train our own will and lift it up. Train it by exercising it. Train it by getting out there and doing things. We can't actually progress by just sitting on the sidelines and watching and thinking, oh my gosh, I'm about to make a mistake, or oh my gosh, what if this is wrong? What if, we need to actually do things. We have in our school, Living Wisdom School, on one of the cabinets in the upper elementary room, there's this little saying, mistakes are okay, they are how I learn. And the same is true with us. We have to get out there and exercise our will. We want to do it in the way that's going to hopefully bring us most in tune with this divine will. So what are some of the characteristics of that? Well, some of them are what we call willingness, a sort of say yes attitude towards life. I had the great joy to teach a class on the 26 keys, maybe even been last weekend, I can't remember, I think it was. A lovely, lovely class on 26 little points that can help us live with the greater awareness that our affirmation talked to us about. And they all have to do with awakening our energy, raising it up, and ways to keep it at that elevated level. You can come in if you want. Someone's knocking at the door. One of them is to say yes to life. And that means to say yes to whatever comes to us. To say yes to things we think are good. To say yes to things we think are challenging. And one lovely example that I know of that experience is one that comes from Kriyananda's life. And it's a time when he was not only trying to start Ananda, but because he was the sole person in charge at this point of paying for everything, he was coming up and teaching classes there on the weekend. This is Ananda Village in California. And then during the week, he'd go down into the city and he'd teach a full week's worth of classes. He would counsel people. Every single moment was filled. And at one point, he thought to himself of all the things that were on his plate, and he thought, I can't do this. I can't do this. And that thought took hold of him. And so he happened to be staying with his parents when he went down into the city. When he got to his parents' home, his mother said, you look terrible. You've got to cancel that class. You can't do that. And he said, I've given my word. I can't just cancel it. So she said, at least lie down for an hour and take a nap. So he laid down, and these things were coursing through his mind. I can't do it. This is too much. All the different things stacked up in his mind. Then he remembered this principle because he'd been trained by Yogananda, his teacher, in willingness. And by the time I'll tell another little story about that. So what he said was he mentally shut every door that said, I can't. And he mentally said yes to each one of those things and said yes to it. He said by the time he was finished that process, he had so much energy that he taught the class, which happened to be on energization. For some of you know this, it's about energy. And then he went on to talk with people afterwards, and he stayed up till 2 in the morning typing letters and correspondence. Pretty interesting, isn't it? It's a wonderful story to reflect on when we have that something in front of us that we think, as Kriyananda said elsewhere, say yes when your mental habits cry, how ridiculous, how can you possibly? The thing is this, energy begets energy, willingness begets energy, and when we put out energy, what happens? We don't have the energy to do it, but by extending the energy towards a greater good, we create a situation where we know nature abhors a vacuum. It draws in. When we raise our energy and expend it in the right way, we draw on cosmic energy to sustain us. So now how does this relate to God's will? I kind of got off here in a tangent. Well, it relates to God's will if the thing we're trying to do is something we don't necessarily want to do. But the other thing it relates to is that with higher energy comes more awareness. And with greater awareness, we are able to tune in more deeply to higher levels of consciousness, which reside in the universe, which flow in the universe in these vast bandwidths. And when our energy is low, we can't tune into them. When our energy is high, we're reaching up inwardly and we draw on those wonderful thoughts, those ideas. That's one of the secrets, Kriyananda says, to genius, is that great energy drawing when we will ourselves to think deeply and creatively. Well, what are some other things that we can do? Looking for goodness. This is an interesting one. Gosh, how would that relate to God's will? Well, it sometimes sounds kind of pat to say it, but love literally is the strongest force in the universe. It's that love of the Creator, that great God beyond creation, that wanted to enjoy himself through many, that caused creation to come into being in the first place. It's what caused the stars and moons and planets, as we say in the Festival of Light, to come into being. And in every situation, there is a tiny spark of that. It may be very hidden. It may be difficult to find. But that love is the actual truth, the truthfulness that the reading talks about when it talks about the qualities of the wise. It's that harmony with that deepest truth. That's why we say it's actually more truthful for someone to say to someone who's ill, instead of saying, you look crummy, to say something like, there's so much light in your eyes. Because what is that doing? That's hearkening to the highest truth in that situation. And it's recognizing that even in a situation where the body might be weak, might be failing, might be having difficulty, that the soul has potential to grow and become stronger. And that's the truth that lies in the heart of every situation that's difficult, that may seem contentious, that whatever. And when we act as channels for that higher truth in what we say and the way we hold it, rather than holding judgment of a situation, if we try and seek that kernel of potential that's in there, we actually draw on God's will, and we can help to bring about a beautiful resolution. There's another little story from Kriyananda's life where someone relates this story that they were out to dinner with him in someone's home. I think it was in Rome. And the husband and wife were bickering constantly. And this person said their natural reaction was to first get critical of the people and then to sort of withdraw their energy because they didn't want to be a part of it. And afterwards they asked Kriyananda, gosh, did you notice how much they were bickering? And he said, no. But now that you mention it, I do realize that I kept feeling to make remarks that not brought out the highest, but that stated the positive in everything that was said. He had trained himself so completely, and his will was upraised to seek that he just drew that out of the situation and became a channel for whatever this couple was able to accept. So, another way that we can do this is concentrating, as we are told to do, at the point between the eyebrows. We do this in meditation, which I'll hope to talk about in a moment. But we can do it all the time too. So what does that do? And not only to concentrate there, what it does is to draw the energy up the subtle spine to that highest center of awareness that we can easily access. And it's the seat of divine will, of our contact with divine will. It's the way that we can send out blessings, send out that soul call. But to also revolve around that point, he says, the thought, my will and thine are one. That's one of the ways that we transmute that lower will, that more egoic will, into that higher will. And to ask in everything we do. The reading, Jesus says to his disciples, watch and pray. Isn't that interesting? It's tempting to think it was just for them. But when we take these nuggets of scripture, we find that there's this kernel in there for us. Even those 3 words, watch and pray. How do we use them in trying to understand God's will? Well, obviously watching our behavior, but even more than that, as we're exercising our will and trying to live in tandem with God's will, to watch the results. Do they bring us the results of our thoughts? Because thoughts beget energy, which begets actions. Do our thoughts, does our energy, do our actions, do they bring a sense of greater true freedom, greater inner freedom, that freedom from circumstances being a certain way, that freedom from how anyone else treats us or how life treats us? Do our actions reflect that? Do they bring about and strengthen that? Another is, do they bring that harmony, that sense of that one truth of love? Are our deeds manifest in that way, or do they cause a sense of disharmony? So watch and pray, praying, establishing that inner contact all the time, what Yogananda called walkie-talkie, whereas in the midst of our daily activities, we're talking to God. We've got that deep friendship that deepens in meditation, but gets deepened even further by constant inner calling. Sharing our thoughts with God. Wasn't that funny? Look what just happened. Oh my gosh, there I did it again. What do you think? And then after a while, we start to develop an internal Geiger counter that lets us know, okay, uh-oh, I've gone too far to the right. Uh-oh, I've gone too far to the left. And we start to understand and feel. We enjoy that feeling of being in God's will. We enjoy that feeling of attunement, that feeling that comes when we know that deep peace and joy that the reading talks of. And we start to be uncomfortable with or recognize our uncomfortableness, our lack of joy when we step outside of it. And it begins to become an inner directive that guides us on our way more and more surely. Let's see if there's anything else because I've kind of talked a lot already. Well, I guess the only other thing I really need to say is that our meditation, satsang, of course, is very important. To be around others who are trying to do the same thing creates this beautiful feedback situation where their energy is upraised as well, and ours is too. So when it's not quite right, we can feel it more easily. And that harmony of being around others who are doing that helps us energetically. We live in an energetic universe, in a magnetic universe. And as we spend our time with those who have the magnetism of seeking that will, it's easier for us to tune into that will. There are cautionary tales of how magnetism in countries and groups of people have taken them way off course. But the opposite is true too. And when we come together like this on Sunday, when we try and hold in our hearts that feeling, as the reading talked about, the wise person has reverence for the wise. So as we tune into the lives of those who have gone before us, who have reached that final goal, and we try to keep their company daily, read their words, try and hold them in our hearts and commune with them. But Finally, meditation. All of these wonderful qualities that it talks about at the end of the reading, the humbleness, truthfulness, contentment, the lack of attachment to the things that bind most people, those can be strengthened in deep meditation, because what happens in deep meditation is we drop those everyday definitions of ourselves. We put at abeyance, we let go of the habits of thought and mind, and we dip into that beautiful clear river that we were talking about earlier. And we're washed clean by it. We get to understand who we are. And the deeper and more consistently we meditate, the more that becomes our reality, until we can say, I and my Father are one. My will is thy will. I'd like to just end by